Welcome to New York University, Casa Italiana, Zerilli-Marimò. It's a great pleasure to have a chance to present Antonio Monda's new book, L'America non esiste, America does not exist. It's a hard act to follow the chairman's voice, but you abide me as I introduce our guest. In a New York Italian website yesterday, there was the announcement of a big challenge between us here at Casa Italiana, presenting Antonio Monda's book with David Leavitt and Daniel Mendelsohn, and the event at the Italian Cultural Institute, where they're presenting the film by Roberto Faenza, based on Peter Cameron's novel, One Day This Pain Will Be Useful to You. I think we beated them. And despite what I just said in the official Casa Facebook page that we are not in competition, I'm glad we did. Thank you. So thank you for your presence here tonight. I'm very happy, and I'm particularly happy and honored that we have a chance to present Antonio's book. I always say that probably only Antonio has been on the stage of Casa Italiana as often as I did. I would like to take this chance to thank him for his incredible intellectual generosity in being with us to present books, films, and intellectual works of other people, and therefore we are delighted that we finally have a chance to talk about his own work. And what some of you might not know is that Antonio's book has been translated in 11 languages. He has published 7 books, and this is his second novel. The previous one, La Soluzione, was also presented here on this stage. This latest book, L'America non esiste, also made, contrary to what that blog said yesterday, the bestseller list in Italy for several weeks. And again, we are delighted that he accepted our invitation to present it here at the Casa. With us to help us in the effort of presenting Antonio's book, we have 2 brilliant American contemporary writers, and I have to say that the most interesting thing was that they'd never met before 10 minutes ago in my office. So Antonio and I had this privilege of being in a green room where Daniel and David talked about each other's work in very interesting, flattering, and very candid terms, and it was a little great privilege to be there and witness that. And I'm glad they accepted our invitation. Daniel Mendelsohn, who is going to speak first, is the author of the international bestseller The Lost, A Search for 6 of 6 Million. He's also the author of the memoir The Elusive Embrace, and of 2 collections of essays, one, How Beautiful It Is and How Easily It Can Be Broken, and the other one, Waiting for the Barbarians, Essays from the Classics to Pop Culture. He's also the translator of the poetry of Cavafy. And then we have David Leavitt, who is a graduate of Yale, and he's the author of many, many books, including A Place I've Never Been, and that's the book that we were discussing a few minutes ago. The Lost Language of Grains, Equal Affections, While England Sleeps, and let me remind you also, Florence, A Delicate Case. Daniel was an adoptive Florentine and Italian for several years, many years. And now he's back between the US, where he teaches at the University of Florida, and Buenos Aires, the city of elections. He has sort of abandoned Florence for another very Italian city in its own style and way. So without further ado, I would like to ask Antonio Monda, David Leavitt, and then Daniel Mendelsohn to take their place on the stage, and we are waiting to hear from them. Thank you.
They left us a pack of batteries. You never know. Are we on? Yes. Okay. I'm Daniel Mendelsohn, and I was misinformed. I was told this was a black tie event. No, actually,
we were all misinformed. You were right.
In my enthusiasm to talk about Antonio's really wonderful novel, which, despite the title, I think it's safe to say that America exists very strongly in this novel. I forgot that I was supposed to host a dinner party tonight, so I'm going to disappear early like a pumpkin in a fairy tale, which is why I'm starting out. For those of you who have not read the novel, it's a little bit odd to talk about this novel when you know Antonio, because there's an irresistible impulse to read it autobiographically or biographically, and I'll get to that in a moment. But basically, what this novel does is to, I think, create a sort of parable about America. And it starts like a fairy tale by getting rid of the parents. So it begins with an accident that kills off the parents of these young people, I think 18 and 22,
Yes,
18,
exactly.
just around the late adolescence and early life. And brings them very quickly to America. We're in the early 1950s, which is a choice I want to ask you about. And he gives to these two siblings, Nicola and Maria, they're from the south of Italy, and he gives them very distinct and different personalities, and the intersection of their lives and the trajectory of their lives once they reach America creates the drama of the novel. Nico, and I think each of the siblings represents actually a current of American culture. I'm going to go out on a limb here. And so the boy is the current of ambition, I would say, and there's an interesting scene when the boat is coming into New York Harbor, and he's very unimpressed by the Statue of Liberty, you know, and he's not sentimental. He feels the heat and the beat of New York life, and he ends up having a very successful career. He begins in the world of boxing. He has no sentimentality about the life that he's had to leave behind in Italy. He gets involved in the boxing world. He makes a marriage to a woman who herself comes from a family that represents a certain American saga, who have reinvented themselves, that great American phrase, and becomes involved in the world of art and the arts. And he, I would say, is the appetitive aspect of American culture. Then there's Maria, who's this sort of dreamy and quite spiritual character who has no appetite, it seems, for the materialistic and even the cultural aspects. She stays in Brooklyn. You know, there's also a Brooklyn-Manhattan thing going on, which I don't want to put my foot in. But let me just say that he wants to be in Manhattan and she stays in Brooklyn. And she is deeply spiritual and ends up having a very interesting love affair with a person who, again, the mate in each case represents something significant, with a person who has not made it in the American scheme. And so those are the two lives that are traced on their ascent into American culture. So I want to start out by asking, so here's where the biographical impulse becomes impossible. Antonio, in case you don't know, is Italian.
No!
He has also come to America. And so the thing, so I'm going to log him some questions now that you have an idea of what the book is. I have to ask about the impulse to dramatize this sort of immigrant experience, which to some extent this is you've managed to write a classically American novel, which I think is very interesting. It is a deeply American novel. And what is the impulse? How has your own experience informed your decision to bifurcate these two kinds of experience? And let's just start with that. What is it?
First of all, thank you, Daniel, thank you, David, thank you, Stefano. First, you mentioned the year 1951. Do you mind if I start from there?
Yeah.
I decided to write this novel and deciding also the year for two reasons. First, because I was not born there, so I wanted to distanciate a little bit myself from the story. Second, because 1951 is the year, or around that time, is the moment where New York becomes the cultural capital of the world. So it replaced Paris. You know, if you were in New York in 1951, going to the movies, you will find all about Eve and the American Paris, Rear Window, and many other great films. If you go to a gallery, you will find Jasper Jones, Willem de Kooning, Mark Rothko, Edward Hopper still was painting. Theater, think of Streetcar Named Desire.
Which actually is mentioned.
Yes, it is. Arthur Miller is one of the characters of the book. And I can continue, of course, literature. One of my favorite books of all times, Wise Blood, Flannery O'Connor, was written in 1951. Not to mention Old Man and the Sea and Catcher of the Rye, and so on. But this is also the year of the infamous Senator McCarthy, who is also one of the characters of the book. So the idea is to imagine a character who is totally, let's face it, two characters, totally autobiographical. It is a self-portrait separated in two parts that discovers America. This book is about discovering America and falling in love with America. And we did with two different point of views and two different souls. Maria, you mentioned, is spiritual, not interested at all in ambition and success. Nicola is very earthy and ambitious, cynical. And I'm afraid to say that I belong to both of them. There is something of Nicola in me and something of Maria. And just one more thing, there is an inspiration. I'm very happy when you said that this is an American novel, but to be honest, the greatest inspiration was French. I had in mind Lucien de Rubempré, Honoré de Balzac character, and also a little bit Bellamy, the Maupassant character. I mean, they're both characters who comes to town, Paris in that case, and they decide to conquer the place. And actually Nicola does. I don't know if I answered my question.
Right, but what I think is really interesting, and it's a very moving, I would say moving gesture in the book, is, you see, if there were just the boy, it would be a very different kind of novel.
Absolutely.
Right, and so what you manage to effect by having this sort of character who in many ways expresses the other aspect of the American myth, you know, the discontent, the person for whom material success doesn't work, you know, the one who's questing, the spiritual questing. You manage to fold into a whole other aspect of the American literary tradition. And I think without that, you know, if it were just Lucien coming to conquer Paris, that's a fun kind of a book, but it's not everything. And that's why I think it's American. But I just want to move to my next set of ideas, which is, and we've already mentioned, this book is a remarkable testament to a kind of delight in a certain moment in American culture, which as we get farther from it looms more gloriously and golden in hindsight. You know, the greatness of post-war New York City, the vibrancy, the energy, the extraordinary creativity, etc., etc. Some of these people are characters. That's a bold gesture, I think, and it starts very early on. You know,
they say Nicola is ambitious, and I am ambitious.
But not the only one, right? No, so what is it like to sort of have these people as characters? I mean, and what do you think you have to do as a writer to make that happen?
First of all, I had a lot of fun of seeing my characters dealing with real people. Senator McCarthy, Elia Kazan, Arthur Miller, Peggy Guggenheim, and many others. Rocky Marciano. And there is an entire, conversation we can have about boxing in this film, and this book. Sorry, I was thinking of the teaser.
But you could have it. I would just ask the question.
And I love very much those kind of novels. Let me give you a very important model, Memorie d'Adrien. How do you call it in English? Adrien Memoirs by Marguerite.
Memoirs of Adrien.
Where you invent characters and you deal with real existing characters. Why I'm doing this? I define this book in different ways: the discovery of America in the 50s, the discovery of the glory of New York in the 50s. But there is another definition. Since you mentioned briefly the characters and what happens to them, this book is about 3 love stories. The first one is very unhappy. It's about a young woman, Maria, and then I want to say a few words about Maria, who falls in love with a dropout, Nathan, a young Jewish actor who comes from an ultra-religious family. It's a true love story, but it's unhappy because, I'm sorry, I don't want to spoil this, he's very, very ill, let me put it this way. The second love story is also very unhappy because it's about Nicola, who marries a very wealthy young woman, Tess. And he does it only because he wants to conquer the top of the world. He wants her money, basically, and the power that Tess can give. And this is very similar, of course, to Bellamy and all the other characters that we mentioned before. And this is another unhappy love story. Then there is the third love story, which is happy, which is the love story between myself and New York City. So this is my declaration of love for this great place.
We all know if you fall in love, if you're a character in a novel and you go for a girl named Tess, you're in trouble. It's scary to say. Another element that I was very interested in, because on the one hand, it's a great immigrant novel, and it is a quintessentially American novel, and then I started thinking there's a great moment early in the novel when they're coming to America. And somebody says to this boy, Nicola, he says, "Ti piace l'America? You like it?" And then he says, "Well, why did you come here?" And he responds, "I had nowhere else, and someone else decided for me."
The someone else is, of course, Hitler, because this guy is a Jew, and of course he escaped from Poland in this case.
But this is, to me, a point at which it made me wonder exactly what culture this novel does belong to. Because on the one hand, you could say that is the story of the immigrant. There's certainly the story of people like my immigrant relatives who just came because there was it.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it's also the story of the people who stayed behind. The poor peasant, that was what their lives were like, right? I had nowhere else to go. You could say it for people who stayed, or you could say it for people who left. So I just want to know I was very interested by this because it seems so American, and yet it could also be a European story in a funny way.
Thank you. Also because I did maybe 40 presentations in Italy of this book, and these are very new questions, and I like that. I really like this. Let me respond by quoting the title. America does not exist. It seems a provocation, and it is a provocation, but actually comes from a great American novel, Henry Miller, Tropic of the Cancer. There is one moment when one of the characters says, America does not exist, it's just an idea, just a name that you gave to an abstract idea. And this, I think, is one of the themes of the book. What is the reality of America? What is the idea of America? And in this ambiguity is what forms both the life of Maria and Nicola, and what formed also my own life. I had in mind a very peculiar idea of America, which was very different from reality, but I happen to like the reality of America even more.
And yet, as I said, you make a sort of gesture throughout the novel to a kind of trope about America. Certainly at that time, so there are these gigantic refrigerators, gigantic automobiles, shiny, colorful, color TV.
Movie theater,
and
even during the day.
My favorite part is when everyone is talking about air conditioning, the uncle, right,
yes,
who runs this building.
Zio Sabatino.
And these two recently immigrated kids hear him talking about saying, well, we're not going to put air conditioning in because it's too expensive. And they don't even know what air conditioning is.
Yes.
So there's a kind of gesture to a certain set of expectations about what America represented, the supermarkets, blah, blah, blah. And then, but you sort of undercut that with this, I thought, actually very 19th century story of tragic, diseased love. You know, that seemed to be very Dumas. You know, that I mean, to some extent, right? You have the artist, the failed artist, who's.
I want to be honest, and I need to be honest. That idea of Nathan, who is the young Jewish actor, who has this love affair, a torrid love affair with the main character, Maria, comes from the inspiration, of course, comes from a great, great short story by Isaac Bashevis Singer. The title is Tiger and Her Demon. And the short story is about the love story of a young, simple-minded girl, Tybal, and a man who pretends to be a devil. This does not happen, of course, in my book, but the idea of something that comes in a very strange and even repulsive way and transformed into a real love story comes definitely from Isaac Singer.
Mm-hmm.
I never thought of Dumas, but of course I take it as a huge compliment.
Well, no, you know, I'm thinking of the Bohème, you know, this sort of figure of the dying artist is a very strong 19th century
absolutely.
gesture, I thought, and it was interesting.
Absent.
Yeah, so, and then the other final thing I want to say is that I was very struck by the way in which there is, and I think this is a European consciousness, I have to say, there is a way in which every detail in this book is shadowed by a sense of history. That even though we're in the land of the new, right? Even the most casual sentences, statements that people make, like when you first introduce the motif of boxing, and you think, oh, boxing.
I'll say a few words about boxing
But
later.
then it turns out that the first boxers you hear about are these famous instances in which fascist champions were outboxed by, in one case, a Jew, and the other case, an African.
Yes.
And so I thought, you know, even these sort of very casual things that go on in the novel. So the story of the father of one of the characters and his experiences at the hands of the fascists, that you never really get away from history. And that, I think, is a very European sensibility.
This is absolutely one of the themes. The structure of the book is, on the first page you have this car accident where the parents die, and in the second chapter, the book is divided into 66 brief chapters. In the second chapter they arrive in America. So the entire book is in America, but if I can use a movie language, there are a lot of flashbacks. There are memories of the past, the parents, the people from the village, the holidays with the parents, the time that Nicola and Maria went either to Naples or to Rome to see St. Peter's, to see La Pietà and other things. And of course, the past is sort of haunting. You reminded me of a funny thing that says a lot about Italian politics. The first presentation I ever did for this book was in Florence. And I had the privilege of having the mayor of Florence presenting the book. The first thing he said was, "This book is about Florence." And I didn't know what to say. And then he explained that there are references to Dante and Botticelli, which is true. But, you know.
Well, in that case, every book is about
Yes.
Florence.
Well, talking about the reference to Dante, I want to say something about Maria. Maria is my favorite character. She's spiritual, deeply religious, and young. She's at the same time extremely spiritual and extremely carnal. There are a couple of erotic scenes in the book between, describing herself and Nathan. And but again, she's absolutely and sincerely spiritual. But being young and not, let's say, she's ignorant. She doesn't remember very well, for example, the prayers. And there is a moment where she remembers a line, which is Vergine Madre Figlia del tuo figlio, which is a line from the Divina Commedia. That's the last chant of Paradiso. Thank you, Professor. And she doesn't remember, is this a prayer or a poem? And the reality is both. Then she remembers a song or a poem by the great Neapolitan poet Salvatore di Giacomo, would say, Dio quante stelle in cielo, God how many stars in the sky. And she does not remember what it is, but she wants to say this, and she goes back to Naples, even to 19th century. One of my favorite reviews that I received says this book starts with Salvatore di Giacomo and ends with Ella Fitzgerald.
Well, also the starry sky is a very Dantesque, wherever it appears. I actually, before I go, I wanted to actually ask about, there's a lot of music
Yes.
in this book. It's strikingly filled with music from the very first chapter where the boy to
They sing
console
Fenesta
himself-
Lascia, which is a typical Neapolitan song of 17th century, correct? Yes, and there is a lot of Ella Fitzgerald, there is Duke Ellington. Ella Fitzgerald herself appears in a small cameo in the book, and actually this comes from a real experience that I had. I never met, of course, Ella Fitzgerald.
I'm sure I saw her in your apartment.
She appears in a scene that I personally like. It's the wedding night of Tess and Nicola, and Tess' wedding present. She's a billionaire. To Nicola is inviting as a surprise Ella Fitzgerald to sing for him The Man I Love. I never experienced that, but once I went to a party and there was a band playing, and I realized I know this guy, and the guy was Bono from the U2. And I said, so this is possible, so I reinvented it by. I know that you have to go.
I do. I'm mortified, but I'm happy that I got to talk about it.
Okay.
Thank you.
There are a couple of seats. I see a lot of people standing.
There is
So why
one
not
seat.
sit Giovanna?
There are two seats right in the middle here, one seat here, there is a chair there. Come occupy these seats, don't stand.
And Occupy Wall Street.
While you're at it.
Why not? Okay.
I think there's a certain security in standing. You know, well, I've noticed that sometimes there are always seats and people always stand. Antonio, this is for me a kind of a role reversal, because I remember being in more or less the same sitting next to you in Capri, except you were interviewing me. And I with all due respect to the Casa Italiana, it was a more beautiful background. In fact, I'm sure we'd all love to be there right now. And so it's a very interesting and very pleasant experience to have the shoe on the other foot. Reading your novel was for me a very interesting experience for a lot of reasons. One is that even though I speak Italian and I lived in Italy for a long time, I'm a very lazy reader, and I don't often read in Italian. So it was I was a little scared. I was worried that I would have more trouble than I did, and I was glad that I was able to read it. And I think what was so interesting to me was, first of all, to realize how few novels I've read by Europeans about New York. Or I can think of 2 novels by Georges Simenon, not that many others. And those I read in translation. So reading this in Italian was sort of fascinating to me, because I think Daniel's absolutely right. In many ways it is a very, very American novel, but in other ways I think it's a very Italian book, in that its perspective is so much an Italian perspective, if that makes sense. That came across to me most viscerally just because of the language, and because of the rhythms of Italian, and the sort of music of Italian, and the reference points that keep coming back. The sort of in the same way that I think Americans who write about Italy are always thinking back to America, thinking sort of across the Atlantic, the book does the same thing with going back to the Italian Renaissance, to painters, to Italian Catholicism. And I was really interested in knowing what it was like for you writing this book. I assume you wrote this in New York.
Yes.
In Italian.
Absolutely.
About well, you were kind of living your life in English. That was the first question I wanted to ask you, was how that experience was for you.
I had this book in mind since I came to New York in 1994. And my English is not good enough to write in English, but I flirted with the idea for a little
I
while.
wondered about that.
Yes, I flirted. But I say no. It's not enough. I need a good translator. I tried, and you will tell me if I achieved, to have a very simple, essential style. I'm happy when I hear that it's a very simple book to read. In this sense, I was thinking to great American writers, and I'm not comparing myself to them. Of course, Hemingway, for example, is very simple and essential, short sentences. Raymond Carver, and a few others. But yes, I flirted with the idea of writing this in English.
David, I have a speculative question for you.
Yes.
One of your books is on Florence,
Yes.
and you wrote it in English. And
Yes.
the same question you asked Antonio.
I've written a lot about Italy in English.
Yes.
Well, I mean,
But the specific one on Florence, since it's...
yeah, I mean, I wouldn't ever pretend that I could possibly write in Italian, and I'm always, incredibly impressed when people are able to cross that line and write in another language. But I think that my experience with my writing about Italy is Italians always said, "Oh, this is so much your Italy," and in a really wonderful way, I feel like this is so much Antonio's America or Antonio's New York. I was thinking, in particular, I'm kind of going off the subject a little bit here, but following from something that Daniel said about the book having a certain antecedent in the story about in Lucien de Rubempré, the young man who comes to town and sort of makes his fortune, but also pointing out that these young people don't come by choice. They have no choice in the matter. They're sent to America, to poor Zio Sabatini, who meets such a terrible end.
There are a lot of funerals in this book.
And yet their parents were immigrants who returned from America.
Yes.
So there's a whole kind of back and forth going on that that really did speak to my experience in Italy, where so many people I knew had relatives in the States, relatives who had gone to the States and then come back. And I think that may be what I mean when I say that there's something very Italian about the book, which is that it doesn't presume immigration to be a kind of a permanent thing. There's a certain back and forth, and the characters don't lose their identities as Italians.
Absolutely. In fact, it's still the theme of the relationship with the past. There is a moment where Nicola goes to a big party on Fifth Avenue, and on the wall there are paintings by Jackson Pollock and a big Rothko, and I admire tremendously both artists. But for some reason he remembers the paintings that his father showed him in Naples, in particular a Titian, a Tiziano. And he understands, he doesn't understand very well what Rothko was telling him, but he understands that he can belong easily to this new world. And in fact, there are a few things that I would like to say about art and boxing, or
Yeah.
the two, some most, I think,
Yeah, that was a fascinating
combination.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
It made some kind of sense to me, but
I must confess that I love boxing. I know that it might sound strange, but I think it's the ultimate sport. This is not something that I say, but Joyce Carol Oates, in a wonderful book that I strongly recommend called On Boxing, analyzed the beauty and the strangeness, the morbid fascination about boxing. And there is an interview with a great champion, George Foreman, who says that boxing is the sport that all the other sports wants to imitate. And I agree, because despite of what the Coubertin used to say, when you engage yourself in a match, you want to win. You want to win, and you want the other guy to lose. And you want to raise your arm, and you want to see the other guy on the ground. And this is exactly what happens in boxing. It's essential, of course it's brutal, of course it can be bloody and even horrible, but it's the ultimate sport. There is a moment that only boxing has, which is the moment where the referee calls both contenders and tell them, the rules. And in that moment, both boxers look at each other in the eye. And who knows about boxing knows that the match is won or lost in that very moment. The boxer who is able to look at the other guy, threatening him enough, wins the match. Because in that look, there is a promise of pain. And if the other guy is not able to push back this threat, he will lose. And this is quite unique. Of course, there is another element. This was New York in 1951. Rocky Marciano was becoming world heavyweight champion. As you know, Rocky Marciano's real name was Rocco Antonio Marchegiano. He was from Abruzzi, from Ripateatina. And it was very easy to me to imagine that these two young Italian kids arrived to New York and, an Italian champion becomes world heavyweight. Actually, one of the last white champion. I don't think he was a great champion though, but that's another story.
Have you boxed? No.
Have you seen me?
No, I asked you because I actually, I have obviously never boxed, but I've sparred.
No.
And I find, very lightly, but I've had boxing gloves on. And it's so interesting, it's so strategic. And it's so much about lightness and touch, which is the biggest surprise.
Not only that, but think how many great writers wrote about box. Hemingway, we mentioned, Faulkner, and Jack London, and think about movies.
I think there's a misapprehension that boxing is a much more brutal sport than it actually is. I think of it very much as strategic. Well, but it's also strategic. It's strategic.
Absolutely.
And
think of Ali versus Foreman. Foreman was much stronger than Ali, and also much in better shape. But Ali was much more intelligent, and he won at the end. With the rope-a-dope tactic. Don't let me go there.
No, it's
we got into that.
Because in my own, tiny little experience of having boxing gloves on, I was amazed at how much I loved it. It was very minimal, but I thought I was the last person in the world who would enjoy it.
Last summer I read again The Fight by Norman Mailer, who I strongly recommend. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. And it's about the Ali Foreman match in Kinshasa.
Let me ask you, getting back to the subject of New York and America, I wanted to ask you about New York. Is New York America? This would be my basic question, because so many of the characters, virtually all the characters in this book are immigrants.
Yes.
The only...
Everybody in New York is an immigrant.
Well, Avery, I guess.
Yes.
Tessa's mother is not. But is
She's
New York
a loss.
America? This is my question.
Okay, let me try to respond in everyone who does not like America or hates America tend to say that New York is not America. I have a different answer. I think New York is what America will be sooner or later. And it's already the accomplishment of America.
So, I'm interested in that. Could you say more about that?
Yes, of course.
This is what America will, all of America
No,
will be.
yes, okay. You deserve a longer answer.
No, it's interesting.
First of all, it's a place where there is the Statue of Liberty in the Bay. It's an accomplishment in melting pot. Of course, there are a lot of tensions. There was a lot of pain. Think about, in the 20s and 30s, the Irish were against Italian, and any kind of horrible kind of racial tensions. But this is a place where, at the end, this melting pot happens and works well. I don't think we can say the same for many other places in this country. So I think this is the model for what America can be, for what the promise of America is.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true, and I think it's something that the book is incredibly effective at portraying. One thing that struck me as I was reading it was not just how many of the characters are immigrants, but you emphasize often what their real names were.
Yes.
At one point,
Because
we see
everybody has a different name, right?
Elia Kazan.
Elia Kazanjoglou.
Right.
And there is a woman whose real name is Betty Perske. Does anyone know who Betty Perske is? Glory Bacall. And of course, Tess Morgan.
Who is the daughter of Avram.
Avram Rosenthal. But they changed their name because it was too Jewish at the time. And so on. We can continue. Rocco Antonio Marchegiano becomes Rocky Marciano.
And there's a character who makes a brief appearance who was new to me, and I looked her up, was Cicieretta Jones?
Yes, Cicieretta
That was
Jones.
Another...
Yes, thank you for...
Cicieretta
Jones is a tragic... Yes, La Venere Nera. It was a tragic story about a woman who was considered the greatest singer of the world for a brief period of time. She was black. And then she made a big mistake singing a song, Sempre Libera, from Traviata, as a statement against racism. And after that, we're talking about 1910, she was ostracized and she died poor, completely forgotten. If you go now to Carnegie Hall, there is what's your name?
The plaque.
A plaque that remembers Cicieretta. She was like the Callas of the times. Yeah. And in the book there are several stories inside stories. For example, this book is not about Cicieretta, but I imagine that Nicola, when he's flirting and courting Tess, goes to a gallery, the Cine Janis gallery, who was, like Gagosian today, the most important gallery of the time. And it happened to be next door to the Carnegie Hall. And then they go, of course, to eat blinis at the Russian tea room and drink champagne.
And Toscanini is...
Toscanini, another immigrant.
Yeah.
Toscanini, who was a role model for Nicola's father, because he was not only the greatest conductor, probably still one of the greatest conductors of all time, but he was a strong anti-fascist, and we understand that the father, although was not a leftist, but was a strong anti-fascist. And talking about politics, before I mentioned only briefly McCarthy. McCarthy does not appear personally in the book, but there are a lot of references to McCarthyism. Actually, there is a character called Rick who falls in love with Maria, and she's a young billionaire, but also a young communist, and who reacts to the power, the luxury of his family, becoming an idealist, and of course, being America of 1951-52, is in trouble soon because of McCarthy and all. Sorry. What I want to say about McCarthy is there is no one that I despise more in the world of anyone that builds his fortune, his career, sending his enemies, political enemies, to jail. But you cannot have a novel or any stories about the 50s ignoring that. So this is a moment of glory, this is the moment where New York becomes the cultural capital of the world, but there are also black, dark clouds.
There's a very good novel about McCarthy, in which McCarthy is a major figure, by Thomas Mallon, that I can't remember the name of right now, the one before Watergate, which also talks about the fact that McCarthy was gay, which is a sort of interesting other little dimension to the McCarthy story. I have one other question, and then maybe we can, when you mentioned Rick is a really interesting character. Rick is the character who, as a reader, you think Maria's going to fall in love with.
Yes.
Everything's set up.
You never know, maybe at the end something happens, I don't know.
Well, but he's the person she in some way should love, but she loves Nathan instead. And there's that.
It happens all the time. You have the perfect love on one side and you pick the other.
Right. Inevitably.
Yeah.
But there's a very haunting sequence of chapters where sort of shortly after spending, I think, a very intense night with Nathan, Maria
I
goes
like,
off.
I like the way you say intense night. with
Intense. Well, my sense is all nights with Nathan would be intense. She goes with Rick to visit his parents, who
Yes.
were in mourning because his
That's
brother's died.
yes, that's the. Oh, you mean yes? There is only one scene, which is 3 brief chapters, that is not in New York in the book. I imagine that Maria and Rick visit Rick's father and mother after Rick's brother dies of cancer, and the brother was very young, was 25 or so. So they want to be, with the parents. And that's the place, that's the moment where she realized that she cannot be with this young, lovable, idealistic, generous man. And incidentally, also there are a political element, because the next weekend, the Burns, this is the name, are expecting Mamie Eisenhower visiting their mansion, their estate. This is the kind of fortune they have.
And there's a brief reference there. It sometimes fascinates me that, like, I remember Italians were amazed when I lived in Italy because I knew so much more about the different names of different kinds of pasta than any Italians did. And you seem to know much more than I do. There's a reference to the dog whose name is Buck.
Buck, yes.
He's much more of an expert on America than this. Who is Buck?
Buck is the dog that, Buck, first of all, it's a reference inside a reference. I want to reveal a secret, and I'm very, very happy because after 40 presentations, the first time I can say this is in America. The opening line of my novel is an homage to another novel. And it's one of my favorite novels of all times, that is Call of the Wild by Jack London. And the opening line is almost identical. In my book is Maria non leggeva I giornali, Maria didn't read the papers, and in Call of the Wild is book, they couldn't read the papers because he's a dog. So
so it's that bad.
Yes, it's that bad.
Okay.
But it is, the invention is, I know that they had a dog, and Mamie Eisenhower loved that dog, but I didn't know the name, so I called Buck.
Okay. Do you want to?
Yes, we can open up the floor. I just want to know that there are copies of the book upstairs. Of course, the book for now is only in Italian. Hopefully soon we'll be able to have a presentation in English with the English version of the book. But for now, Rizzoli is selling copies of the books upstairs, and Antonio will stand it for you if you want. I participated in the production of the book, and I fell in love with the character of Maria before she actually acquired a paper presence, because Antonio was telling me the subject of this new book, and I immediately was fascinated with her. I have to say that she did not disappoint me. But since I've been so involved in the whole process, I want to step down a minute in this case and see if any of you, whether you've read the book or not, I think so many things have been said that you might have questions even if you've not read the book yet. Yes, Serena Said.
Yeah, I have a question. I have not read the book, but I bought it.
Thank you.
That's the best letter of the audience.
It's enough, thank you.
But my question is, I heard the comment on how simple is the style of your writing.
I tried.
And so that an American who was afraid not to understand it, I understood it. And I wonder if the fact that you live in America and speak in English every day has simplified your way of writing in Italian.
Definitely, yes. The answer is yes. And I hope to be simpler and simpler. Yes. That's my goal. So my goal is to become like Julius Caesar. I'm talking about the writer,
Like
not
the Emperor of Rome.
So is the implication of that Italian writers are not simple in their style?
I didn't say that. I didn't.
Yes.
Gallia est hominis divisa in partes tres. Gallia is divided into 3 parts. I think that's perfection of language. So simple, so effective. And he was not exactly a writer, he was famous for other stuff. But he wrote 2 marvelous books.
No, but to go back to Serena's observation, yeah, the whole idea is that, of course, Italian writers use a lot of subordination, much more than English writers, very long periods. And we have to say that there is a certain trend also in Italian literature to go more and more in a sort of American syntax style. So very contemporary writers also tend, not only Antonio, but also others, to go into this more simplified syntax. It's sort of a general trend. But I do think that Antonio, the more he stays here, the more he absorbs the sort of...
That's incredible. That's really interesting to me, because I think I see a trend with American writers in the opposite direction. When I look at my students who read, all of whom love Thomas Bernhard, I see this kind of dramatic, sort of Austro-Hungarian, these dense blocks of prose, and I sometimes wonder if these things go, you know, if in every culture there's a sort of aspiration toward another culture style of writing. Sort of as the Americans fall in love with the European style and vice versa.
I forgot to mention before another film that came out in 1951, which is Sunset Boulevard, which is incidentally one of my favorite films of all
And we
time.
saw a very short clip.
Yes, because there is a moment where Maria goes to the movies and she doesn't know anything about Sunset Boulevard, but she knows this is very strange. There is a voiceover of someone who's dead, and this is the only thing she noticed.
Yes, lady there.
I'm wondering, Antonio, if you read Flannery O'Connor and Jack London before you came to America or afterwards?
No, both before. Both before.
So they've shaped.
I used to read much more when I was in my 20s. I must admit that I never went back to Jack London after the 20s, while I still go back often to Flannery O'Connor. It does not say that I won't like Jack London, not at all.
Sally.
I've gotten a copy of the book. I look forward to reading it, and sadly, or not sadly, I look forward to reading it in Italian because it was written in Italian about a city that we all live in, and I wondered, when it is published in English, will you actually write the translation for
No,
it?
if this will happen, there will be a translator.
Do you already?
Of course, I will eventually supervise
Right.
and discuss with the translator, as it happened in my previous books. Yes.
Right, and do you already have?
No, we'll see.
Yeah,
I
because
also-
I think the one wonderful thing for all of us is that it has your sensibilities about it. And
I will make sure if this happens that there is nothing lost in translation.
Do we have other questions?
Yes.
Or comments? Yes.
Yes.
President.
How can you manage spirituality and ambitions? You said you are part of Maria and part of Nicola.
I don't.
He's a very conflicted man.
I don't, but I do manage to have together carnality and spirituality. Yes. And this comes once again from one of my favorite writers, Isaac Singer. All his characters, including himself, was both spiritual and carnal.
I think that's true Flannery O'Connor as well. There's
There's
a sort of
Flannery O'Connor, yes.
surprising
Absolutely.
eroticism of
Absolutely.
Flannery O'Connor, sort of just under the surface.
Yes.
Do we have any other question? I think we had a short and intense dialogue, and that's how we like it. I think we did indeed beat the Italian Cultural Institute in boxing terms. I'm very happy about it, and I'm delighted to have had a chance to present Antonio Monda's book, L'America non esiste. In the discussion that we had, what appears clearly is that this America exists more than ever in Antonio's line and in his mind. And I think from all we said also, our wish to Antonio to see this book very soon published into English and available for the American public.
Now tell me why these butters are on the table.
Because you never know.
Because you're the everybody bunny.
You never know. Thank you all very much again. Thank you for David Leavitt.
The book teaser that you saw before was made by a young filmmaker. He's only 20. His name is Maurizio Lamba.
Excellent. Very good job. Thank you.